I ngā mana, I ngā reo, I ngā iwi, e rau rangatira mai. No mai, haere mai, piki mai. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Kia ora, hui mai, tātou katoa. My name is Laura Peters and I work at the Newland Library and Community Hub, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this conversation this evening. We are delighted to host this event, supported by our friends at Tāmaki Treaty Workers. To Dr Susan Healy, member of Tāmaki Treaty Workers, thank you for giving your time to this evening to share your work. No mai, haere mai, welcome. Dr Susan Healy attended the Waitangi Tribunal hearing of the Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu Claim, where leading Ngāpuhi experts presented their history and intentions in entering into He Whakaputanga and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. She is co-author of Ngāpuhi Speaks, He Whakaputanga, and Te Tiriti o Waitangi, independent report on the Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu Claim. The seminar will be recorded this evening for the Heritage Arts and Culture Department at Auckland Libraries. Please be aware that by staying in this seminar, you consent to this recording. Just a couple of housekeeping rules this evening. We would appreciate if you could please be muted and your videos turned off while Dr. Susan is presenting. There will be 2 opportunities for breakout rooms this evening for you to participate in, and these breakout rooms will not be recorded. Please put any questions you have for Dr. Susan into the chat window. I have my wonderful colleague, Kristen Joy, here to moderate, and we will have time at the end of the presentation to answer some of these questions. Finally, before handing over, I would like to offer an opening karakia for this evening. Tū taua mai e runga, tū taua mai e raro, tū taura mai e roto, tū taura mai e waho. Kia tau ai te Maori tū, te Maori ora, ki te katoa, haumie, huie, taikie. Kia ora and thank you everyone. I will now hand over to Dr. Susan. Thank you.
Oh, kia ora Laura, mō tō mihi, mō tō karakia hoki. Nā mihi kia koutou katoa. Thank you so much for coming this evening and for sensing the importance of the things that we're to look at. So the name of the seminar is there in front of you, He Whakaputanga o Te Rangatiratanga o Tireni, the key to understanding Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Just to give you some background, the background that I'm coming from, as Laura said, I was involved as part of a panel that went to the Waitangi Tribunal hearing from Ngāpuhi Speaks, and I'm showing here a number 2, Laura. I don't know if is my screen not working with yours? Oh, thank you. So that this is the cover of the Ngāpuhi Speaks, which I gather quite a few of you are very familiar with already. And going on from there, so if we can go on to the next slide, I think we need to keep moving fairly. So it's an independent report on the Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu Claim regarding He Whakaputanga o Te Rangatiratanga o Tireni and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. And I will just mention here that originally, there's a lot of negotiations that go on before a Waitangi Tribunal hearing. And in those negotiations, at first, those negotiating on behalf of the tribunal said, well, we really need to stop at 1840. That was the signing of the treaty. But the Ngāpuhi negotiators were very insistent that it was essential that He Whakaputanga was there, because that was so key to understanding Te Tiriti. So the taumata, which is a body of Ngāpuhi kuia and kaumatua, had felt that the Waitangi Tribunal was being very slow and had thought of having an independent panel, and even though the hearing did go ahead sooner than they had first expected, they decided that it would be really valuable to have a set of independent observers. Originally, they'd hoped to have a couple of people from overseas, but that didn't work out. So key figures in supporting this were Titi Whai Harawira, Mere Mangu, Hilda Hawkyard Harawira, and kaumatua Nuki Aldridge, who was really expertly advised us. And below this are the members of our panel. So just to say about myself, I'm a Pākehā of Irish, Cornish, and English descent. So a number of these slides, I'll let you just read through them and make comment as needed. So we'll keep moving through this one, Laura. So I want to make this point because I'm assuming that a lot of you are doing research work of your own, and I think it's really important to recognise what your starting point is. Ngāpuhi Speak was very clear, and you'd be clear about that from that mandate that was put there, that we were to start with the evidence given by the Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu speakers. And it seems, for me, looking back, that it's very hard to see that wouldn't happen, because we had 5 weeks of presentations, and I would feel that at the most, we would have had non-Ngāpuhi Tonu speakers speaking, and even then some of those were tangata whenua. So I found it, I had written this some time ago about the Waitangi Tribunal favouring written historical sources. And today I thought, well, maybe I was a bit unfair, I'll go back and have a look. But I just felt, as I read the first book from the Waitangi Tribunal, that a huge amount of the evidence is actually based quite strongly on written sources. It's not saying there isn't valuable material there, but it does bring some bias. And I just want to give one little example that really struck me. I was reading there that, and I'll bring up other examples as I go along, but it's talking about the missionaries at Rangihoua being invited. This is where the first missionaries were invited to make a settlement. And it says the missionaries at Rangihoua were left at Ruatara's mercy, which was undoubtedly his intention. Now, as I read that, I thought somehow that didn't gel from the evidence I heard at the hearing. Especially this, they were held at his mercy. On the other hand, if you go to Hugh Rihari's evidence, and it's really worth, if you can, accessing his actual whole evidence, which we only give little parts of in the report, the whole picture he gives entirely differently. It's about going back to Te Pāhu, whom his people are descended from, making relationships, building up relationships, inviting people to come. When they're coming, developing relationships of care and respect with one another. So I just want to point out that thinking about starting point actually makes a huge point. It made a big difference. And yes, I think that's really the point that I want to make about that. So I'll go on to the next one. So this is going through the topics that I'll be looking at. I want to talk first about what He Whakaputanga is not, or the Declaration of Independence. Then I'm going to have a break where you can go into groups to introduce yourselves to one another, because I feel quite strongly about this, that we're a learning community and we're learning as a country, and talking on having a Zoom session can be very, very isolating. So I think if we have a couple of points at least where people can come together, talk together in small groups, at least it gives that sense of belonging to something wider. I'll look at the significance of the Ngāpuhi claim, the historical context, which was stressed very strongly at the hearing, who wrote it and what it says. Then I've got a question, the significance of He Whakaputanga, various dimensions of that significance. And then I look at, coming back to the actual topic, He Whakaputanga, the key to Tiriti or Waitangi. So we'll move on to this question. Oh, sorry, I've said I'd say something about He Whakaputanga, what it's not first, so I'll do that first of all. The things that a lot of us that have done treaty education, probably even up to 10 years ago, if you took a group, you'd only find about a fifth, if you're lucky, even knew it existed. Then if you looked at what was written at that time and earlier, you would see that it was put as a document, only of course it's called the Declaration of Independence, put together by James Busby. So Busby is the initiator, the person who put this forward, and he got some rangatira who obligingly agreed to sign up to it. This is what it's not, that it was a response to a fear of the French. Now, for Busby, that may have been some little fear that the French were establishing a settlement, but that being a fear was not even mentioned at the hearing that we went to. It's not a declaration of independence because the Declaration of Independence comes when you've been had another authority over you and you gain your independence. I think probably though at that time it was valuable, 1835, right, that period, it was valuable to be called a Declaration of Independence because it did establish very clearly that the British couldn't just simply come in and take over. It was the acknowledgement of a sovereignty that was there. And another thing that it's not is that it came from a group of leaders that were just helped to come together towards forming a group for the first time. That is not correct either. So I just felt it's good for us to appreciate the pictures of He Whakaputanga that we received, most of us, until fairly recently. Oh, the other one is that with the signing of the treaty, He Whakaputanga, or certainly the Declaration of Independence, what didn't matter any longer, that it was completely supplanted by the treaty. So that's, again, something that the Declaration of Independence, He Whakaputanga, is not. It was not supplanted by the treaty. Okay, we'll go on to our groups. Oh, and have I skipped the bit about the significance of the Ngāpuhi Nui? I will have the groups now. So you'll be put into groups of 5 and you've just got about 5 minutes. So I'm asking you in your group to just say briefly who you are, where you're from, and then maybe 1 or 2 of these points. What do you hope to gain or what knowledge are you bringing to this evening? So enjoy yourself in your groups, and I look forward to meeting with you again. Kia ora, everybody. Lovely to see you. It was very interesting being in our group, and especially because seem to have people who are involved with influencing or teaching others. So I hope a lot of this will be really useful. Maybe I just need to make really clear, the Waitangi Tribunal is the body that heard all the evidence that I talked about over those 5 weeks. It was actually spread over a year, but it was in 5 different weeks. And they make out a report, and theirs is an impressive, it's a 2-volume report. Te Raki 1 and Te Raki 2. And it was done with a lot of resourcing. Ours was 4 people, although I must admit we were accountable and had the backing and input from some very knowledgeable Ngāpuhi. But ours is the 1 volume and it's called Ngāpuhi Speaks. It's an independent report. I think its value lies in exactly what I said, that more strongly than the tribunal report, it does bring to the fore the things that were said by Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu, which included hapu from Auckland, well north, but the main body being much further north. Okay, so I want to say something about the significance of this claim. So Laura will go on to the next slide. So the Waitangi Tribunal was established in 1975 and was able to investigate historic claims from 1985. But this claim I've put here was a radical advance in considering sovereignty issues, because from its beginning, the tribunal was asked to work from the Maori and English texts of the treaty. And I was just checking the act. If you look at the actual act, the first, where it gives the documents, the first document that appears is the English one that says very clearly that Maori ceded their sovereignty. So, and I noticed on the Waitangi Tribunal website that it is using, I feel the English text doesn't really make clear the actual differences between Te Tiriti and the English text. So Ngāpuhi Tonu said to the tribunal, we want you to hear what we intended in proclaiming He Whakaputanga and signing Te Tiriti Waitangi before you consider specific claims. So they wanted that clarity about what they meant going into those, as they said, covenants. Okay, we'll go on from there. So these are just 2 images. It was a dramatic and interesting and tiring time. Patu Hohepa, who's a very highly regarded academic, and Eri Mahenare, who had huge knowledge coming through from his family in particular. Okay, we'll move on. So, He Whakaputanga, the speakers said time and time again, it must be seen in its historical context. So moving on from there. This mightn't seem like historical, but I just thought there's some themes that you'll find as we go through that keep coming up. So this is a slide I actually use when I'm working with people who've got hardly any knowledge at all, but you've got whānau, which is family in a much broader sense than a lot of us townie, particularly Pākehā people, are used to, or then you've got hapu, which are groups of whānau, and the rangatira were leaders of those. Now, it was the leaders of hapu that signed Te Tiriti Waitangi. And then you've got iwi, where they're confederations, and we'll be saying more about that idea of a confederation, groups coming together to decide things together. So it's not at a top-down arrangement, but I will say more about that. So let's move on from there. So early Maori relationships with Pākehā, and particularly this is talking from the north, although elements of these things happen through a lot of the country, maybe sometimes at different times. So the first contact were with people like James Cook, and trade with Pākehā continued on from there on. that's another point that we'll be making later, but Maori within themselves, up and down the country, were great traders. They were traded with one another. So drawing in and interacting and trading with Pākehā or other nationalities too that arrived on the shores was no problem, just part of the development. What I found very interesting, I hadn't realized that with these boats coming, you got Maori traveling overseas. And particularly as you go well into the 1800s, Maori would go overseas and come back, and then often a group would meet with them. And so they were filling in their own people with this picture of the international world that they were encountering. So this whole dynamic of interacting and learning was there. I think we've just, thank you. The whalers and sealers came. Very important was the development of relationships with the Australian governors, because that was the first person-to-person contact with people that represented the British Crown. So a very significant visit was by this rangatira called Te Pahi, who visited Governor King, and he wanted to bring up several issues. One was because with some of their people traveling on these ships, they found that the captains of the ships were incredibly harsh, cruel. They'd also had instances going right back to the time of Cook where Maori had been fired on and killed. So Te Pahi wanted to talk about these issues. The other thing, there were instances of ships coming in and just taking things off somebody's land. And again, I was really interested when I read about Te Pahi. I think I've thought more and more, the Maori world is a negotiating world. So he went because he wanted to understand the British system and where they were coming from. Because if you're going to negotiate with somebody, you've got to have some understanding of them so that you can start meeting. So that was part, but he became very friendly with Governor King and got an assurance that the governor would try and do something about those sailing onto the shores of this country, but that proved not to be very effective. And then you had meetings of different rangatira meeting with the British monarchs. Most importantly was this body that goes back to 1808. And one way it goes much, much further back than that. In the north, on what was called the Taiamai Gardens, which were not too far away from Kaikohe, the people there had gardens that people from quite a wide area across Ngāpuhi, but even from across the country. So you would have visits there from key leaders from Waikato, from Tuwharetoa, from I'm just having a memory blank, but you had these relationships building up there. So these went back well before 1808, but they got a certain sharpness of meeting in 1808 because Te Pahi, when he came back from his meeting with Governor King, met with the other rangatira, particularly of the north, and said, because of the impact of this outside world, we are needing to have some shared policies and ideas about how to move forward in dealing with them. And so from that developed what is called the whakamininga of the hapu, the United Assembly of Tribal Nations. All right, go on to Kristen. Had you got a question you wanted to put? Okay. So just to say something about this whakamininga, well, I'll let you read because I've made some of those points already. And I'll come back to this point again, that having the structure like the United Nations meant each hapu and each leader stood along one side one another, as in the United Nations. It wasn't a structure where one body was on top and dictated to others. When we deal with Busby, he tends to hope that this was the sort of structure that Maori would move towards. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. So from 1814, we had those first missionaries coming. They were significant because they really came to settle, unlike some of the whalers and sealers. Some of them individually came, but a community coming and settling were these early missionaries. And Maori understood that they had very close relationship with the British Crown, so they're quite influential. And then you get rangatira, some even earlier than this, but one of the very significant visits was Hongi Hika, who was a key leader of that assembly of rangatira, and Waikato went and met with George IV in 1820. Now, Waikato was the equivalent of like a secretary. He'd been at every meeting of the whakaminenga, and he had that ability to carry the information, hold it together. So he was this key figure. He was, although he's called Waikato, he wasn't from the Waikato. He was called Waikato, but he belonged to Ngāpuhi, and he travelled with Hongi Hika. And Manuka Henry gave us lovely pictures from the newspapers of how well received these rangatira were, and they certainly made, King George IV was quite a young man, and he was very taken with these two rangatira. I think part of what would have impressed him, and we've just seen, we can see even now, there's these sort of rather obsequious relationships to the British Crown, whereas they met with George IV as rangatira to rangatira. So, and we heard evidence how that sense of friendship developed and continued. Jumping quite some way forward, and we're talking now about William IV, and as in hapu and royalty, relationships do get handed through from generation to generation. The Northern Rangatira sent a letter, a formal letter to William IV, who was now the monarch, asking him to do something about lawless Pākehā. So there were Pākehā who they dealt with as missionaries and traders perfectly satisfactory, but there were numbers of Pākehā in different situations who were quite troublesome. And in the Maori world, if I'm a rangatira, I'm responsible for my people. And if I've got a problem with somebody else's people, I go to them, other rangatira, and ask them to deal with it. So what they were saying is that they were asking William IV to do something about Pākehā who weren't prepared to show respect for often for one another, but also towards the communities that they were impacting on. So James Busby was sent here to represent the British government in 1833, and in some ways his arrival was seen as a response to that letter. They'd asked for William IV to take some responsibility for his people. James Busby was sent here, and James Busby in the first little while actually did successfully deal with some tricky situations. But as time went on, he just had no sufficient backing from the British government and found he couldn't deal with some of the problems that started to grow. I'll just mention this fact that the Northern Rangatira dropped a flag for New Zealand ships, and that they then in 1835 were coming that they declared their sovereignty. So we'll go to the next slide. So let's take a minute and think, what do you already know about this flag, where it came from, what have you been taught about it? So this flag was, I suppose, finally agreed on in 1834 by a number of rangatira, and I'll stay with the flag if that's okay. And in James Busby's presence. But part of the misinformation we've had about the flag is we've had this picture that James Busby came in, arrived in the country, saw there was a problem, and presented rangatira with 3 flags. What we heard at the Ngāpuhi Nui Tonu hearing was quite different. One of the, a Maori partly owned ship had been seized in Sydney in 1830. And so I think it was 1831 actually, but discussion followed from that. The Maori at home were really concerned about the seizing of this ship because they actually had a lot of trade going backwards and forwards into Sydney and other parts of Australia. And so they actually started talking with Henry Williams, the missionary, because he was a naval man. He had a background in flags, what was needed for ship registration. They talked with the officials at the port in Sydney, and they actually had flags already, but they could see that they needed a flag that would be internationally recognised so they wouldn't have those ongoing problems. So by the time they met with Busby, a lot of discussion had gone on beforehand. It wasn't just simply a case of Busby sweeping in and bringing people together. And even this, again, was a little bit disappointed me in the Tribunal report, because this is how it's talked about Busby. Before leaving for New Zealand, Busby was approached by the then owner of the New Zealander, Joseph Hickey Gross, who sought to register for the ship. Busby astutely recognised that the issue provided an opportunity for him to draw the chiefs, who would probably never have contemplated confederating for any national purpose, into working in concert. So there's not a criticism of that, because that was James Busby's, in his mindset. He was dealing with tribal groups that didn't have strong relationships with one another. He didn't know about He Whakaputanga, about how it worked, about the fact that groups could be independent but still come together and were making combined decisions. And what disappointed me in that account from the Tribunal report is that it says Busby astutely recognised that the chiefs had never contemplated confederating for any purpose. Well, the evidence at the Tribunal, at the hearing, was quite the opposite of that. They had been meeting, they had formed a body, they were dealing with things, and dealing with the flag was another part of it. And this is what I think the people kept saying, there was a continuity of history that was behind all of this, which is so often not understood, not recognised. Let's move on from there. So these are important things leading up to the signing of He Whakaputanga, or that making of that declaration. The Northern Rangatira sent that letter to William IV asking him, and again, that was in history. If you remember Te Pahi, and this is going right back to 1805, those are the very things he was discussing with the governor in Australia. So there was a whole continuity in asking the British monarchy to deal with their people. James Busby sent to New Zealand to represent the British government. The Northern Rangatira adopted a flag, and that, in actual fact, I do want to say this about the flag, that was seen as there was a real act of friendship on the British part, because once that flag a copy of it was sent back to England, the King actually decreed that any of the British Navy, which was incredibly extensive, if they saw that ship, they had a duty to protect it. And while in local waters, Maori were more than capable of defending themselves, when they were going right up far into the Pacific, over to the Americas, up into parts of Asia, there were pirates. And so to know that you had the protection where it could be called on of the British Navy was actually a very favourable thing. So we also got this picture of this real warmth and positiveness of relationship between the rangatira and between the British monarchs. And then we get this declaration of sovereignty to the international world. So we'll go on from there. Who wrote it and what it says? Now, again, the conventional history, or the history that many of us read in the books, was that it was written by James Busby, and that if anything, there was this worry about the French, and the English would have been a bit worried about the French. But Baron de Thierry probably didn't have a lot of power, but he was claiming the setting up a French settlement in the Hokianga region, and the British didn't mind Maori being independent at that stage, but they certainly were very worried that the French might establish a colony. So the picture is that the conventional picture, Busby wrote up this Whakaputanga, which will prevent any power coming in from outside. But this is, again, we heard a different story. And some of it becomes clear as we actually look at parts of the text. Okay, yes. I think we might just go back to that previous one for a minute. There was a young man, Eruera Pare, who had been encouraged by Rangatira going back into the 1820s, yes, in the 1820s, to learn to read and write Maori and English. And he did incredibly well. And he actually ended up becoming a secretary to Busby. So the people from the north felt very strongly, the people presenting, that Eruera Pare was a key figure in writing that document. It wasn't simply something written by Busby. And as I was saying, as we go into the language, we'll look at why that they held that view quite strongly. So going to look at the actual document, just picking up a couple, I'm going to pick up some of these in different writing, but this is what the actual copy looks like. So kaumatua, ko ngā tino rangatira o ngā iwi o New Tireni, I raro mai o Hauraki. So north of Hauraki. So we are the tino rangatira north of Hauraki. So the rangatira who belonged to the whakamininga were very clear, as the Maori world is, that they had a say in relation to territory north of Hauraki. They didn't have a say over land further south, because you respect the people of the place it is. But any of you that know anything about the treaty know that tino rangatira or tino rangatiratanga is a very key word that's there. And then in the next part, ko te kingitanga, ko te mana I te whenua, o te wakamininga o New Tireni, kia mea tia nei, kei ngā tino rangatira anake. The kingitanga, they're picking up on a word that made sense to the British, because this was a declaration to the world of their mana. The mana in the land of the whakamininga belongs to these rangatira alone, anake. So we'll go on and look at the next bit. Next, yes. So these are various people that signed it. The second name down, Hare Hongi, is the second son of Hongi Hika, who went over in 1820. Unfortunately, Hongi Hika died in 1828, so he actually wasn't there at this time. But Waikato's name is there. I don't know that we can pick it out very easily. Te Kemara, there's various ones. The interesting thing is that the rangatira from the Hokianga, many of them actually couldn't come to the signing on the 28th of October, 1835, because there was a big flood. So if we go over onto the next page, you'll start to see some dates like the 13th of January 1936, where it's got Kiwi Kiwi. These are some of the people that couldn't get to that first signing, and that did come later. But the other thing is, you start to look down, there's an 1837 date, there's an 1838 date, very significantly 1839, called Te Wero, Whero, who is Waikato from Waikato, and a really major leader. So here's the document moving to different parts of the country and being signed, not throughout the country, but particularly the people that had relationships to the people in the north. And very significantly, it was signed in 1890. So that's 50 years after, 50 years after the signing of the treaty. He Whakaputanga was still being signed. So that says something about its ongoing life. So we'll go on from there. So I wanted to pick up on some of the pieces in the actual wording. So this is in the first article. I've mentioned there the Tino Rangatira, and the translation by Manuka Henare, we the absolute leaders of the tribes, or the people of New Zealand north of Hauraki. So our authority is absolute in this area. Doesn't mean absolute over their people. Each one had to be accountable to their own people, but absolute in relation to the world in general, because it was explained to us several times, the point of this declaration was a declaration to the rest of the world. By this time, there were growing relationships of the world. Some of those travelled talked about they'd seen Indigenous people oppressed in other parts of the world. So the whole range of reasons, but this sense of being a people of mana was important, and it was important that other nations and even people like the sea captains, all those people understood this. Now, this other phrase, we declare the authority and leadership of our country and say and declare them to be prosperous economy and a chiefly country, Whenua, Whenua, Rangatira, that what those were linguistic experts, Ngāpuhi linguists, said having that phrase, Whenua Rangatira, was a classic phrase. And this pointed out very clearly that it wouldn't have been put there simply by translation by somebody like Henry Williams, because, and in the original Maori, because they can recognize, this is talking about today's linguistic experts, the treaty is more like missionary Maori. What they were saying, and this is why they're saying that Ere Pare and the Rangatira had a real say in putting this together, was the use of phrases like Whenua Rangatira. And Nuki Aldridge, who advised us, said it allows others to be invited into the land in peace and under the authority of the tribal leadership. Now, so this is a question that's been put there. Did James Bubsby do the draft? No, this is what the view that we got. It was like the flag. The Rangatira having some issues in dealing with things overseas. They talked with James Clendon, who was an American trader. They talked with Henry Williams, and they talked with James Busby. And it could well have been that James Busby advised them that if they made some declaration like this, it would both give them strength in dealing with the international world. So the statement just didn't come out of James Busby's head at all. It came out of the Rangatira talking about it again and again. They said, this is our statement. It wasn't James Busby's statement, it was our statement. And what's more, the writing in it, they felt very strongly that the actual writer would have been Erowera Pare because of the sort of the Maori that's used in it. So any of you that can go back to the Ngāpuhi Speaks, a lot of this is spelt out in quite a lot of detail. Okay, going on to Article 2. So what it's saying is the sovereignty or the kingship and the mana from the land are declared to belong solely to the true leaders, the tino rangatira. So very clear that the rangatira are the sole people with full authority. And it goes on to say this: we also declare that we will not allow any other group to frame laws, nor any other governorship to be established in the lands of our confederation, unless appointed by us to carry out the laws we enact in our assembly. So I'll take a second just to let you read that. So they appreciated that there would be groups, whether it was a small French group or a small British group, that would have their own community. But what they're saying is that they wouldn't have any exercise of authority unless it was within what was allowed by the Confederation. And that word kaumatua, that exercise of authority or exercise of any exercise of governing was only as they would allow it. Okay, let's go on to the next one. This is actually going back over one of those phrases from the one before, but in the commentary in Ngāpuhi Speaks, it says all the Ngāpuhi scholars are in agreement that the authority, Maori understanding of mana, is more than an authority over the land. It's an authority which flows from the land. Ko te mana I te whenua is mana which flows from Papa Tuanuku, Mother Earth. It is contained in the land and flows from her. So again, we'll come back to this, but this sense that there's an authority in the earth and that is imparted to people, the community that lives within that area, is very, very important. So if we're talking about things like sovereignty, we're actually, the whole context is very different when you're talking about from a Maori sense of what these terms mean. Okay, what's next? Oh, so this is just summing up. There are 4 articles in it. So we've actually, the first one is what's in the first one, what's in the second one. Any foreign kaumatua will be as they direct. They will meet in Congress each year. Busby's said to England they're not meeting. They're supposed to meet at Waitangi every year. But as pointed out, the group actually met more than once a year, but they would go to different places because they're saying the point, you'd never keep having a hui where it's representing a big area at the one point, because there's a huge amount involved in hosting it. So like with our 5 weeks of hearings, we went to 4 different marae. We came back to one a second time, but that's the point they were making. You've got Busby grumbling, oh, they didn't keep meeting at Waitangi, but in actual fact, they were meeting. But in the Maori world, to be able to sustain that hosting, it must be moved around the different groups. And then the rangatira wanted a reaffirmation of this mutual care and protection between the rangatira and the King of England. Okay. So now I've asked that you go back into your groups again and taking those points that we've just made, what do you think were the understandings of the rangatira brought to Te Reti Waitangi? I mean, we've talked about what they understood by tunu rangatira, by also by kaumatua. So it was only 5 years later, the treaty, what understandings were deep in their intention in moving on to Te Reti Waitangi. So we'll move into our groups for that. Sorry, I'll try and go through fairly smartly. Somebody made a very good point at the end of our discussion that this seems a bit romantic. What I took out of the, really this was on the British side, what I took from those hearings is that the Ngāpuhi rangatira had reason to, that they were gaining something out of that relationship at that stage for the British. But they were also very aware of what the colonizing world is like. And I certainly, I won't say a lot about the colonizing world. It's quite a lot of it said in the actual report, but it certainly came from this position. Well, you can tell even from the way that history is told, that I'm talking about the sort of Busby-centered history. The center of everything was the British world or the European world, that they were dealing with natives who they would respect on certain terms, but always their structures, their ways of doing things were definitely more advanced and superior. So it probably pays for me just to mention that very briefly. All right, let's just move on from here and probably go fairly quickly. So can we go fairly quickly? Yeah. Well, this is just repeating again. So what we said, that the Maori world operated at different levels, but the starting point was the mana of whānau and hapu, or could have put in there even the whānau of the whenua itself. Okay, let's move on from there. At one stage when there was discussion about models, I just thought that assembly, this is one abstraction. It actually ignores that there were incredible numbers of relationships between and among the members of that group. But can I just go back to that at collegial assembly? The point is that people come together and they face one another. And I've noticed today that people will say Maori, when it's coming to like representative in regional councils, city councils, we want a place at the table. And that's because in this model, you come together. And I noticed talking about the Waikato River Authority and Hugh Kafu talking about the arrangement with the city council over the land, the Ngāti Whātua land in near the city, that they always favour, and they get groups that will work with them to favour consensus decision making. And that comes from coming like this as equals round a table. And when we go to look at the treaty, really what was being allowed to Hobson on behalf of the Crown was that he would have a place at that table. He wouldn't be on top of the table. He would simply have a place for his iwi around that table. Okay, let's move on from there. This is a powerful statement. I'll let you just read it about why it would be impossible for Rangatira to agree to cede their mana or their sovereignty. All right, we'll move on. And this was evidence given by Pat Korowha. He Whakaputanga was a declaration of the world of Maori mana and sovereignty. Te Tiriti did not change this, but reaffirmed it as the coming together of sovereign nations to create an enduring relationship for the prosperity of all. And again, if you really listen to what mana whenua often is saying, or local groups too. I mean, I was just listening to John Tamahiri talking about Te Whānau Waiparera. There's that eye out to the overall good. It's a deep concern for their people, but it's also an eye to the overall good, because if the overall good's not healthy, it's not good for anybody, really. Okay, let's move on from there. Sir Edward Jury made this important observation. The first principle of traditional social organisation is that political power was vested at the basic community or hapu level. Power flowed from the people up and not from the top down. Now, what Busby thought the Confederation was for was dictating to all the different hapu. He believed in the British system where you had a very hierarchical system. But what Sir Edward Jury is pointing out, that the tangata whenua system, governing system, is that the power starts in the local community and moves upwards. It's not this highly centralized model. And the next one, this is something I put together after listening to Moana Jackson, and listening to the people speaking up north, that they spoke again about the rangatira have a face-to-face accountability to the communities they serve. It was the hapu that directed the rangatira, so it was very clear that rangatira could be empowered to make certain decisions, but they always had to bring them back, and they got their direction from their hapu. But also that sense that authority comes from the land and the local community, from the whenua and the people upwards. And it made me think of the system of governing that we've inherited through the British system and through the European system, that formation of monarchs, because originally in Europe, people lived in villages and in tribes. But once you got monarchs, you actually got one person starting to exert authority over a much wider area and group. So then you get the centralization of power, you get resources all having to come into that center. And I think that even our democracies have developed out of that model. I find myself getting really irritated when they talk about non-elected members, Maori members. The Maori tradition is this face-to-face accountability. In the present system, it mightn't always work the best way, but that is the tradition that it's come out of. So saying that individual votes is more accountable than this sort of system, to me, is a very dubious statement. All right, we'll keep moving. I'll let you read this. So Rangatiratanga is very much about this deep commitment to the relationship to Mother Earth, to the land, might be the bay, your mountain, your river, that deep care, and of the people that come into that area. Okay, moving on. So we live in a very commodified world, and we see this today. That, you know, what is it? Climb the ladder, buying and selling land. In the hapu world, land wasn't bought or sold. They were great traders and lots of things, but not in land. Land, you had that deep relationship, your people's relationship were there from centuries often. So, and your stories and your identity was all built out of that relationship. But going on from there, so however, this didn't mean, and to me, this is a really, really important concept, and I can't say a lot more about it here, but it was certainly brought up at the hearing that about tuku whenua, that people were given a place on hapu land and outsiders were given a place. I mean, it goes way back before Europeans came. A person or group from an outside might be granted land on hapu land. But it was all about setting up a relationship. So the new settlers were expected to respect the hapu, but the hapu had a duty to protect them. And I actually think maybe even if we think about what's happened with the occupation in Wellington, one of the good things is that government is joining with mana whenua in that ritual of restoring the land. And so we are starting on certain levels to make at least some little moves towards that sort of relationship that was intended in the first place. That when Ngāti Whātua or Ōrākei gave a place to the governor and his people, it was entirely meant to be this relationship of mutual support and benefit, that each would work together. There would be and I've mentioned there that a lot of early Europeans were totally dependent on being housed and looked after when they first arrived in the country. Okay, so it was geared towards relationships, and the whole thing about the treaty, these relationships of mutual benefit. And I'll let you read this too. So again, and you see this when you go onto somebody else's marae, you follow the custom or the kawa of that marae. This respect for the place of each hapu, of each group within the country, because the colonizing thing was totally the opposite that. It's disrespecting the ground of the people that you're coming to when it's that enforced presence. And another writer has said one of the reasons we gave that deep respect was because we recognized that they had that guardianship role, and we didn't know what their laws or where they were at in terms of their harvesting, of caring for the land. And so this whole thing about respecting, growing up, this was law that they grew up with, respecting the place of each hapu. Okay, going on from there. We got a lot of interesting background from the hearing about this. At one stage, there was this big prison in Sydney. This is in the 1820s, 30s, and it was almost completely dependent on Maori trading food, on food sent over on those Maori ships. So, and about the extent of that travel. So go on again. So this is the key. These are the Rangatira statements, and I'm probably going to finish here because it has run on fairly, I've run on, but so let's just see what the Rangatira had to say. He Whakaputanga was a declaration of the world of Maori, mana and sovereignty. The treaty did not change this, but reaffirmed it. We've had that one before. Let's go on to the next one. He Whakaputanga te matua, te tiriti te maiti. Whakaputanga is the parent, te tiriti is the child. So what it's saying, really, He Whakaputanga comes first, not just in time, but in precedence. It's the whole base for understanding the treaty relationship. And again, I'll just go back that the governor in the treaty would sit as one with the chiefs. He was being invited into that assembly as one. So these two mana came together, the mana of England and the mana of the chiefs of New Zealand. And the next one. According to the Houses of Learning, all agreed in Ngāpuhi that the treaty did not override the declaration, never. The treaty, its purpose was to allow foreigners to reside here because of our concern about the things they were doing at the time. So they agreed to this covenant. So it's ongoing, the Whakaputanga. And I'm just going to finish with a rather interesting statement. This is from Hobson. I knew nothing about this and still did some background reading when we had to put our report together. But in the Maori world, it's those conversations that really matter. And this is what Hobson said to the Rangatira. He presents himself as representing the Queen. So this is before any further discussion went on. He's talking about our people have been able to go where they're pleased, and we can't restrain them in other places where we don't have authority. Her Majesty asks you to sign this treaty and to give her that power which will enable her to restrain them. Now that is exactly what right back to Pahi was asking Governor King in Australia to do something about the ship's captains. The letter in 1831 was about asking the king to do something about his people. And here it is, Hobson echoing the same thing. So from the Crown side, what he was actually saying is we're asking you to sign this so that she will have the power to enable her to restrain them. And that would be a reason why the Rangatira were open to the treaty, because they felt that Busby hadn't had the authority to restrain people, and they wanted a more effective governing presence for the Pākehā people. Okay, I think I better finish and see if there's any questions in the last few minutes. I'm sorry it's taken so long.
Kia ora, thank you, Susan. I'll put the first question from Elise in the chat and read it out now. Is it correct to assume that He Whakaputanga is a constitutional and internationally recognised document?
Yes, if you go back to that period, 1835, following that, it was recognised. The King of England recognised it. Yes, it was. William IV recognised it. And there's references in French documents and American documents. And in actual fact, because it was recognised, that's why to have any sort of formal presence here at all, the British Crown had to negotiate a treaty and get an okay from Rangatira that that place could be held. Now, I don't have enough background about today how much that's recognised. I think that this evidence that's been put forward will be something that keep moving things in that direction.
Kia ora. A question from Catherine. How would you describe Busby's role now that we know that he was not the architect of He Whakaputanga?
Well, he came representing the British Crown, and to some extent what I read is that the way he presented himself, he more or less presented himself as like an ambassador. So his role was to represent the British Crown in dealing with rangatira. That's what his role was. And in actual fact, in many ways, that was the role of the governor when a governor was appointed too.
And Elise was wondering, do you know how He Whakaputanga moved around the whenua when it was being signed?
No, I don't. But if you remember, there were Waikato rangatira who used to come up from the Waikato at certain times up north. So they were part of those discussions at the Taimai Gardens. So I think it being moved around would be a case of those relationships and the talk and having that opportunity coming out of those relationships. Yeah.
And a final question here. Do you know what flag was used before He Whakaputanga flag?
There wasn't just one flag. There were various different hapu. A number of them chose to have a flag. As a result of those travels, they could see that, you know, this was something that added to saying who you were. So that, and I think even the ship that was seized had like one made of flax. So for me, what was very interesting, because I'm having a little difficulty remembering the detail about that, but there was a man this is a Pākehā historian, who was published in the Listener in 2010, just as this hearing was going past. And I just felt a lot of what he wrote was totally off the things. And one of the things he said, Maori didn't know about flags. Well, that was absolute rot. They'd been traveling around the world, people knew about flags. So yeah, some of them in their ships. And you've got to remember there were ships going from the South Island, different parts of the North Island. It wasn't just the North. Yeah.
Kia ora, Susan. We'll finish with the question section there. And I would just like to give a huge mihi out to you for spending your evening with us today from the Newland Community Hub, from every single person that's attending today, and the 140 that are on our wait list that will probably come to the next one if it's possible that we can stand another one up. I think we've all learned a huge amount that we didn't know before, and just by the number of people that are so interested in this kaupapa at the moment, it's actually really exciting that as a nation we're moving forward learning the true history of Aotearoa, and your work has really been a part of that. So I want to thank you so much for all your mahi and for your time this evening. Thank you very much.
Can I just say something? I'll have to talk with Laura, but I found in the group I was in, there are a number of people involved with teaching, and I have always made the my PowerPoint available to people that participate in things I come to. So I will ask Laura if it's possible for that to be sent out to participants.
Wonderful.
Absolutely.
I'd just like to say one thing to the participants. In a minute, Laura will do our closing karakia, and then if you would like to stay on, and a lot of people have given some feedback already, but if you would like to stay on and give some feedback in the chat, I will save it and I will pass it on to Susan. and also everyone that's enabled this to happen, so that they'll see how much energy there is for these sort of seminars. And so you're welcome to put that in the chat after the karakia, and now I'll hand over to Laura for the closing karakia.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Kristen, for moderating the chat this evening, and for all of you for coming along, and especially Dr. Susan for sharing her knowledge with us. I learned so much tonight. As Kristen mentioned, it was very popular, so we would love to look at running this again later in the year, so do keep an eye out for that. And we would also really love to look at holding something that includes a Māori perspective on this. So please just watch this space on either our Facebook pages, and you will see it pop up hopefully later in the year. So I will finish tonight with a karakia. Tu taua mai e runga, tu taua mai e raro, tu taua mai I roto, tu taua mai I waho, kia tau ai te Maori tū, te Maori ora, ki te katoa, humie, huie, taikie.
Kia ora.
Thank you everyone for taking your time this evening. Ka kite.